When we look at the history of the American voting public, you have to look at the different eras and the different groups that have been given the right to vote over the course of our history. So in order to do that, we need to step back and look at the founding of our country. And under the original Constitution, it was essentially that white, male property owners were the only people that could vote. That would slowly get erased over the course of our history, first looking at the 15th Amendment, which granted African American males the right to vote and eliminated race as a factor determining voter qualification. But for the African American population, the passage of the 15th Amendment was not a gateway to unqualified voting rights. What we saw is that states would institute things like the poll tax or literacy tests or the grandfather clause that was served as a roadblock to African American voting. And it wasn't until really the 1960s and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that finally eliminated the literacy test as an obstacle for voting, that full voting rights were realized for African Americans. With the passage of the 19th Amendment, we saw the voting population double in our country as women were granted the right to vote. So women's suffrage came about with the 19th Amendment and greatly expanded our voting population. Finally, I'd like to touch on the fact that with the 26th Amendment, 18 to 21-year-olds were granted the right to vote. As we've discussed previously, this group did not vote in high numbers, and that has been something that has dropped our turnout rates. Now, those are just the things that get you to the voting booth. When we look at the factors that affect your voting behavior, we're going to look at a few things. First, we'll start out with geography. We'll start with the South. The Solid South traditionally was a Democratic stronghold, but now, as of today, is very strongly in the camp of the Republican Party. If you look at the far west, the West Coast, very strong lean to the Democratic Party, especially anchored by California. If you look at the Great Lakes region, and that's where you've got Ohio and Michigan, you have several swing states in there that are very important in the presidential election. And there has been a trend in the past for Democratic voting there, but once again, they're swing states and vary by election. If we move on to the coattail effect, this is the presence of a strong presidential candidate at the top of a party ticket. So in 1980, when Ronald Reagan ran for the presidency, a lot of Republicans were able to ride Reagan's popularity into the seats in Congress. So they grabbed onto his coattails and let him lead them to victory, and that was the Reagan Revolution of 1980. With a critical or realigning election, we have a long-term change in political alignment. We move the electorate from one party to the other. The clearest example I can give you is 1932, when the country went from being majority Republican to majority Democrat on the strength of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And that change happened in the 1930s and lasted through the 1960s. Party affiliation is probably the strongest predictor of voting behavior. We've had a lot of people who, unsurprisingly, register Democrat and then turn out voting for Democrats. Vice versa, those who register Republican likely to vote Republican. It is important to note that nearly 1/3 of our electorate now identifies themselves as independents, and that's been a decline in the Republican and Democratic Party membership. So this has kind of undermined the influence of party affiliation. Media can also play a role in voting behavior, as the way that the campaigns are covered can impact people's decisions. And then we've touched on it before, but it bears repeating that demographics are important in determining how a person votes. When it comes to gender, we have the gender gap, and females have moved since the 1970s very strongly into the Democratic Party camp. When we talk about race, white people tend to vote for Republicans, African Americans vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party, and Hispanic voters tend to vote strongly for the Democratic Party. When we look at social class, lower class people tend to vote Democrat, upper class people tend to vote Republican. It's important to note that union members have always been strong supporters of the Democratic Party, but the number of union workers in this country has been declining steadily over the past 30 to 50 years, thus cutting into the Democratic Party support. When it comes to things like religion, Protestants vote Republican, Catholics lean to the Democratic Party, but are influenced by the Republicans, especially on social issues. When we talk about social conservatives, and Jewish people are more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. These are just a few factors.